So I just want to welcome everybody to this session. This is panel session 5 on the topic of best practices in research with Indigenous communities. I'm Stephanie Merrill, and I'm mostly technical host today. I'll be passing it off shortly. I just wanted to basically do a little bit of housekeeping. So to all attendees, if you have been thinking about a question throughout the discussions, please feel free to put that into the Q&A function in the toolbar in the bottom. We will use those to generate some discussion near the end. The session will be recorded and made available later. However, we will not be circulating any slide decks. You can listen to the webinar. You can also view closed captionings, and you can turn that on by turning on closed captioning in the toolbar in the bottom. And of course, feel free to engage on all of the Global Water Futures workshops today using social media. We want to encourage everybody, although I know it's not going to be an issue, to practice a positive code of conduct today. We want to create an environment where everybody is welcome to speak their truth, speak their experiences without feeling like they can't do that. And so this is the code of conduct for the entire Global Water Futures annual science meeting this year. And with that, I am going to pass it off to Dawn, and she is going to introduce today's discussion.
Hi, good afternoon. Welcome to our session on best practices. I am chairing the session, and the Indigenous Advisory Council of Global Water Futures had requested that we have an elder do the opening and opening words. And generally, as a Mohawk woman from Six Nations, coming to you from Haudenosaunee territory, I also would like to acknowledge that in our tradition, generally the elder goes first, and then we'll introduce the panel, if that's okay. I'd like to welcome Chief Orville Looking Horse to do the opening prayer. Chief Orville Looking Horse is the 19th generation keeper of the White Buffalo Calf Pipe Bundle and holds responsibility as spiritual leader of the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota people. He holds an honorary doctorate from the University of South Dakota and travels and speaks extensively on peace, environment, water, Indigenous rights, and issues. He has been the recipient of several awards, including the Wolf Award of Canada, the Forgiveness Award, United Nations Juliet Hollister Temple of Understanding Award, and has dedicated his life's work to peace. He is the author of the White Buffalo Teachings and a guest columnist for Indian Country Today. An advocate of maintaining traditional spiritual practices, he is the founder of the Bigfoot Riders, which memorializes the massacre at Wounded Knee. A skilled horseman, he shares his knowledge with the youth on the long distance rides, which is a healing journey. And it takes place throughout South Dakota, as well as the Dakota 38+2 ride. He's a very busy person, and without much further interruption, I'd just like him to start with I'd asked him to do an opening prayer. Please do not record this. You're able to stay for the discussion later, but it would be great if you were, but I know you're busy. So if people have questions, maybe you can start putting them in now if you want to talk. We do have time. I'll introduce the panel, and then we'll get started. Lori's having a little bit of difficulty with her Wi-Fi, as happens on reserve, and many of us are coming from rural communities. My name is Dawn Martin Hill. I'm a anthropologist from McMaster University and have 3 Global Water Futures projects. And at Six Nations, we do face challenges with water. Lori Davis Hill is one of our leads, and she is the director of the Six Nations Health Services and the Indigenous Health Lead. She's also part of the Indigenous ecological training and co-creation of mixed method tools, as well as the co-creation grant. So she's been of great help to our community in many ways. Leon Andrew, another esteemed, knowledgeable elder, is Mountain Dene. He's with Walter Beza Satu Dene. They're with GWF Project Water Knowledge Camps, building capacity for cross-cultural water knowledge research and environmental monitoring. And Rudo Kemper will be joining us from Digital Democracy. He is with Indigenous Traditional Ecological Knowledge. So I'm going to start with just a few opening remarks because I certainly can't follow the wisdom of what Orville has presented. But I think we're all here because we care deeply about water and water research and our environment as Indigenous people. We face many challenges. So Catherine, if you could put the PowerPoint up, I'll just briefly go over some of the positionalities that I share as an academic, working in a university with science agencies, but also as a Mohawk woman advocating for rights and justice for my people. I use this picture of Einstein. It's back from the 1940s. He did spend quite a bit of time working with Indigenous elders, particularly the Navajo and the Hopi, looking for information on star knowledge, or what I would call Indigenous astronomy. So our people have been invested in science for a very long time. It was interrupted with colonialism and suppressed for about 150 years. And the state that we're in right now is we're just coming out of that oppressive period where our knowledge and ways of knowing was diminished to mythology and stereotypes, and storytelling was considered a fable. However, I think science, Western science, is in its infancy compared to the knowledge that our elders have of Turtle Island from creation to today. Any of them can share those stories with you. And what I find is people who are really, really interested and kind of smart, like Einstein, they knew that and they spent time with our people. So NASA has reached out to Orville and many others. And then you have, your average person who's just interested in Indigenous issues. But what I find is the main bulk of society, mainstream society, tends to think or dismiss our knowledge. And a best practice panel is here to not only share their research, but to identify ways that science can work with our people in a respectful and equitable way. So if you could switch the slide. So I was involved in Naylor's scientific review. There's billions of dollars that are set aside by governments to fund research, and we've been left out of that for many, many years. Science hasn't been reviewed or evaluated. I think this was 50 years that Canada had a policy that was outdated and did not include Indigenous people. So I was invited to present there and advocated for the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing. And what the Naylor report did put into under the 5.7 was that the three council, and this was one of my recommendations, that the three granting councils collaborate to develop a comprehensive strategic plan to promote long-term support for Indigenous research, enhancing research by training and with Indigenous communities, by Indigenous communities. The Truth and Reconciliation also advocated for this. So a lot of Indigenous people, scholars, elders did put together a base framework of what they would like to see Canada do. And I had suggested that at least 4% of what goes into all these agencies and SHRC and CIHR is that we don't fit into their boxes. We don't fit into the cultures over here, and engineering is over here and water is in this box, and it's a barrier. It's something that we're trying to remove because our people as was pointed out by Chief Looking Horse, we work in an interdependent, holistic way. So our way of thinking and our paradigm needs to be considered and understood as integrated and interdependent. And this often is problematic for scientists who are in disciplines that are often siloed and don't work together. So our projects under traditional ecological knowledge or best practices has worked hard. Sometimes it's exhausting to have an integrated approach, and GWF has been very supportive of this. Even if they don't understand it, they do understand that we are the experts, and that's a beginning. Next slide, please. One of the primary goals of Indigenous people, and I attend a lot of these national conferences about, research in Canada with Indigenous people, is that most Canadians are unaware is we're not in control of our own data. So science comes to us generally wanting to do a number of different things, and then they leave with that data, or that data isn't really relevant to our needs. So self-determination is interlocked with data sovereignty and ownership, control, and access, which is what OCAP laws that all science must abide by now reiterate. So we need to develop our own data sets. For example, here at the Grand River, they have sensors on the other end of the river for non-Indigenous people and Brantford and then Caledonia, but there's never been water monitoring along the Grand River where we are. Questioned them why, they didn't have a good answer. So we're often left out, if erased, by all kinds of data that we would like to have. So a big push within Indigenous communities is not only to control research that is meaningful and important to our people, but also that we have sovereignty over that data so that it stays in our community in its raw form, and that we're able to analyze it according to our own worldview and framework. So those things are very important. And lastly, and I'm sure that others will discuss this, is decolonizing research requires sharing of resources and benefits. As I said, it's $1 billion industry between the three agencies that fund research, and we've been left out of that leadership in there. What we need in order to decolonize and to rebuild our nations from a really difficult 150 years is we need research, and we want to do and engage in research. And I will say honestly and sincerely that Global Water Futures has responded incredibly well in the last 3 years. I've worked with other agencies for 15 years, and they haven't come along as quickly and as astutely as Global Water Futures. So we need allies. And I think today what we're going to hear from the best practices panel is ways to be good researchers with Indigenous communities. And the mantra is nothing about our people or our lands or our waters without us. So I'll leave it at that and introduce Lori Davis Hill as our presenter. And she's going to be sharing a PowerPoint. Are you okay there? Is the Wi-Fi backup? We're struggling here at Six Nations with Wi-Fi, and you're on mute.
Yeah, so there you go. You can hear me now, good?
There you go. Hi, Lori.
And can you see my slides?
Yep.
Okay. So Scano, I am Lori Davis Hill from Six Nations of the Grand River, Mohawk Wolf Clan. I am the community health lead. I'm also the director of health services at Six Nations of the Grand River. And I have been the incident command for the last 400 and something days that we've been in a state of emergency regarding COVID. So just to give you a little bit of context, Six Nations of the Grand River is located in southern Ontario. It's the largest community of Haudenosaunee in Canada. We have over 28,000 band members, and nearly half of those reside on the reserve. The green that you see on the slide is the Haldeman Tract. That was our original agreement. And the orange is the existing Six Nations Reserve today. So we're located about 25 kilometers southwest of Hamilton in Ontario. and reflect a spiritual worldview that emanates through all aspects of our lives, including our identity, our language, our water, our land, our culture, and food. And this is increasingly difficult with the small space that we have available. Six Nations Health Services is the Department of Six Nations of the Grand River elected council responsible for helping people to maintain their health and wellness through the provision of healthcare services or the assisting with their access to healthcare services. So because we offer care to all our members across the lifespan from prenatal to palliative care, as a department, we're typically approached 5 or more times a year to support or engage in research projects. And so that equates to over 50 times in the past 10 years. And we currently have about 5 major projects running with health services. In the more recent years, this has been shifted from research that's been generated outside the community and sort of parachuted into to us to research supporting community initiated and developed research questions. We have a community-based research ethics committee that is currently undergoing modernization to reflect the progress made in the larger academic environment. Ideally, we'll progress to where the Six Nations Haudenosaunee community has its own research and institute center to develop a research program of priorities. This is one of our strategic goals. So just to outline many of the best practices that we have identified through our work, I'll go through them and then I'll explain a little bit about how we have actualized this at Six Nations. So we need to respect the local protocols and processes of the community. We need to build relationships with local leadership, community stakeholders, and members through community engagement and outreach activities. We require to have greater input or review throughout the research processes from elders and the community members. We need to practice anti-oppressive and decolonial research methods. We need to engage Indigenous resources that challenge the limitations of academia. We need to acknowledge that communities are research deprived and share the resources equitably, including the provision of staff and students to the community. We need to contribute to a project and a product that will directly benefit an Indigenous community. And we need to write for an Indigenous audience. So that's applying language and multiple mediums that are contextually or culturally relevant, like using visual arts to convey findings in a meaningful manner. So guiding us here at Six Nations has been a Haudenosaunee cosmology. So Indigenous knowledge understands health as the emotional, spiritual, physical, mental, and social well-being of a people, which also includes sustaining relationships with the natural world in a profound.
I think we lost Lori. Oh
Oh,
no.
no.
Are you there?
I'm here.
Okay, you're back.
I'm back. Sorry.
Yep, it's okay.
I'm not sure where I ended. And I don't know how to go back. Okay. So our Indigenous knowledge respects the interconnectedness of everything, respect to be shown for all of the relationships in our natural environment, and water being foundational to the well-being of all living things. Water quality is directly linked to human health. So that's been a big part of the Indigenous project. We're also guided by the two wampum or Guswenta, created in the 17th century between the Haudenosaunee Nation and Dutch settlers. And you notice on the belt, there are alternating rows of purple and white wampum. The two purple rows are symbolizing the vessels traveling the river of life. And so the river is depicted in the white, and the two rows are the Indigenous and the non-Indigenous. So the three white rows that separate and surround the vessels symbolize Skana, Ganquio, and Gaza Stensila. So it's a and wellness.
We lost you for 1 minute there. You're just starting a model of collaboration?
Okay, sorry.
It's okay.
Oops. So the Gaswenta is a model of collaboration between the two systems. And so our goal is to harmonize the Indigenous worldview and the non-Indigenous worldview for the benefit of both. Also, as part of our the research methodology, and the Indigenous research is grounded in Haudenosaunee philosophy and Indigenous methodology with the Gaswenta and the Ohondo Galiwadekwa. So really looking at what is sensitive to our oral traditions, our ceremonies, and the relationship that we have from our teachings and our historical ways of being to a current present day and how that impacts us. So when we started down this pathway, we were looking at doing research regarding health and water. And we had to do an examination of what was already done. So we looked at our health status, our health needs, and discovered that there were multiple projects, but none that we could actually compare to get a longitudinal look at our health status. So we had to develop a survey that contributed to the research, but also contributed to the community for our mutual benefit. So our research questions are guided by community input, and that's one of our priorities. This co-creation refers to and means, like Dawn said, nothing about us without us. So today, the lack of access to clean water for the community is a significant health concern, affecting mental, physical, and spiritual well-being of youth, mothers, and their families. So even though we're in the midst of Southern Ontario, we still have families and homes where there is no clean running water. So we've created a water use and Haudenosaunee health survey, a youth-informed resilience application, Joy Pop, and maternal water and health interviews. So the community partners in this project were Six Nations Health Services, our Six Nations Birthing Center, and a Six Nations Youth Mental Wellness Advisory Group. And they are all working together to drive the research development. Looking at physical health, the survey that I spoke about helped to center our Haudenosaunee health models and reflect the interests, concerns, and assessment structures that were meaningful for Six Nations people. So rather than just imposing a predetermined survey on the community, there was a lot of back and forth, and the survey created and acted as a boundary object, and that helped us to co-construct knowledge and navigate our relationships between our stakeholders. So we're basically working at the margins of our communities and enhancing our communication across the boundaries. So it helped us to reflect on our priorities, on our gaps, and to really be appropriate culturally and community based in what we were offering. So we ended up with 3 versions because it has taken, it's some time to get to what we really want and need. So we have a long form health survey that was focused on physical health and our priorities. Then we did a pilot health and water use survey that helped us to look at how water use inform exposure, and then a comprehensive water and health survey. Really culturally centered and useful for both health services, the birthing center, clan mothers, hunters, and fishers. So it will have a much broader application through this whole research project. We also looked at mental health, and we used a mobile app called Joy Pop to reflect on how the sort of settler psychological science can inform the research and be adapted for Indigenous science research. So working with our local Gawanio private school and really finding a way to reflect Haudenosaunee wellness in a model that works for many different stakeholders, I guess. And also being able to integrate sights and sounds from the natural world as well as cultural teachings into this kind of mainstream designed app which will be something that our community will see themselves in, and so are much likely to be connected to it. And also, working with the birthing center, we recognize the importance of water and prenatal health, and looking at from the perspective of the midwives at our Genoa Unagratsta, our birthing center. And the research was essentially co-created between the midwives and the McMaster researchers. So looking at interviews with mothers on their water security. How do you birth babies at home with no water? And how does it feel to have newborn, when you have to be water insecure? So, and also, taking the opportunity to build on some previously completed research, and go back through those charts and reassess those charts, and then integrate it with current interview data. So between the birthing center and our maternity care researchers, we were able to conduct 56 maternal health interviews and collect data from 39 client charts. And this is far and above what we would have expected. And so the midwives saw this as a priority because they saw the value to this work in supporting the mothers in our community. And one of the COVID-19 adaptations we did as part of the project was that the midwives actually did the interviews rather than researchers. And so the data that was collected and the participation of our community members was absolutely increased and showed us a large value in being able to make those connections. So thank you for your attention.
Oh, now, Lori, that was great. I just have to say Six Nations is doing amazing when they took over the research because of COVID, not allowing non-members in. It would have taken a PhD student like 3 or 4 years to collect that many interviews. So we learned some lessons there for sure.
Sure did. Thank you for including us in this. Yeah.
So I'm going to introduce Leon Andrew from Mountain Dene and Walter Bezha. Am I saying it correctly? Yes, maybe close. And you have a guest with you as well, Walter. Did you want to introduce yourself?
Go ahead, Walter.
Debbie?
Oh, yeah, Deborah Simmons, fellow
Hi.
traveler with the Sawtoo Renewable Resources Board. Mossy.
So who's going to go first? Is that you, Leon?
Leon.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you, Walter. Appreciate that. Yeah, very interesting. Your elder that spoke there is something that resonated with me, and I appreciate that. Anyway, what we decided to talk about was that a while back we held a couple of kind of a science and traditional culture, cross-culture camp. I want to talk a little bit about that. The first one we did was, from town, we went to one of those bigger lake at the base of the mountain, because we knew there was a lot of good fish there, and it was a good place to do a research on the science people that are with us at the time. So when we got out there, we set up our camp, and there was already somebody, my cousin has a camp there, so we and they help us out. And we started working together with the science, the traditional knowledge people and the science. We learn a lot by just talking and sharing. And what we as Dene people, we demonstrate our way of life, how we survive in the bush, all that, how we hunt for caribou or how we hunt for moose, etc. We kind of demonstrate that while they were there, and how to go fishing with fish nets. And they had done all that. And what we learned from the scientists is that was one of the first time we did work with science. Prior to that, they were kind of doing things on their own, but since that time, we've been involved with them. Anyway, what we learned from one of the scientists was a fisher lady, and he talked about fish, whitefish, all different kind of fish, how you can tell the age, how you can tell where you can get them.
Cross-cultural research camp you went to was Oak.
And I can hear you guys. And we did another one. Sorry. So they told us how you can tell the age of a fish. So that was very interesting. And the other thing, when we talk about the health of the water, they also taught show us how they can tell whether the lake or the river or creeks are safe to drink. And they were using another method. And they have little fish, little bugs. They have a name for it. I forget what it's called. But they identify those two little bugs that says these are the bugs that tell you if the water is healthy or not. As long as they're in the water, you shouldn't feel too bad about the safety of the water or for to drink. So that was very encouraging, and we learned from that. And the other part the scientists showed us was about the forest, how the forests grow, how in relation to the cut lines, seismic cut lines, the industry cut lines, and stuff like that. What we learned from them is very, very interesting there too. Again, how the trees from across the road trying to reach out across to the other one on the other side, and somehow the roots come and work together towards one another, and once they meet, up come the plants again and vegetation, and the tree grow all over again on some of those cut lines. So that was very interesting. And when they talk a little bit about fire too, how the fire's been pretty wild out there in some of the Northwest Territory area and the south over in BC and stuff like that, Alberta. So there's a lot of old growth, so that's what usually makes the flame so wild to even bother trying to put it out. So that's one thing they taught us too. So we learned from that. And the other person taught us about little birds. Up here for us since the 1970s, the weather fluctuated so bad in May that a lot of birds came back and it all disappeared on us overnight because it froze so bad. But since that time, since 70, the birds are going slowly down, the little ones. And this year we hardly see any birds. See a couple of robins so far, and that's kind of not in my mind, it's not very good. And what do we learn from the scientists? How they know they're in the bush? They use recorders. They put that in the bush, and they told us that if the birds are in the mating season, they're calling for partners. Said one bird can hang around in one area for a long time. They would sing till their partner arrived or another one come along, and then it quieten down. Then they have partners. So there's another thing we learned from science. And then the groundwater. This is especially unique in a way for me because when the elder did the opening, talk about spirituality related to water. We have learned that from our elders, our forefathers. So that's really something to think about. And we have heard those kind of comments. a message left for us by our elders. And so water for us is very sacred too. You know, we do a lot of gift offering in traditional knowledge wise. But what the scientists have told us about is that only way they can find out where the groundwater is by digging wells or drilling holes into the ground to determine where the groundwater are. So that we learned that from them in that sense. So we did that kind of program was a scientist, and we have learned a lot from them, and hopefully they learn something from us. We share some stuff with them, but like somebody mentioned there about data that kind of disappear and not being monitored properly. I think myself, I see that. I don't know, I've still got time, but you know, I would just want to say today up here in the north, you know, it's getting really worrisome about water because of climate change. You got too much water, you got less water. It's just fluctuating real bad. So I'm kind of worried about that in the water. So we working really hard to see what voice our concern about waters that hopefully, if I miss something, I'm sure my colleagues will follow up on that. So I'll leave it there. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you. That was really enlightening. Your area is really beautiful up there. We're kind of surrounded by cities, so a little envious of all that land you do have access to.
Mhm.
We are going to have questions. I know there are some, so Leon can answer questions as well as Lori if we have time at the end of the session. So thank you, Nyawe, for sharing. I think Walter is going to share some of his wisdom and his research with us as well.
I see Leon, and I appreciate being here and listening to everyone, especially the chief that spoke at the beginning. We have, you know, just we have Great Bear Lakes, or Satu, I should call it, and the biggest lake within the boundaries of Canada. I would say it's still very, very healthy, and that's where I come from. I guess I lived on the land with my people for many years, but I've also gone to many institutions to learn about wildlife and land and water. So, and that made me I think that made me understand my own grandfather, my own people, the way they talk about the environment and certainly the land. Spirituality has always been part of me. I grew up with spirituality with my grandfather, and yet it's taken me a career and probably being part of the Delenigutin government and certainly Aboriginal governments before I realized how important that is to me. Now that's me, my history, a little bit of it. I'm 68 years old. Now that you have the challenge, if that's how long it takes me to understand my grandfather, my history, my wildlife, and my land and water, how long would it take our own people today, our children today? We had a cross-cultural water camp that I went to on the Bear River. And I think it really opened, you know, many things that we need to understand. Not only that, but to relate to it, because you're going back and forth between two cultures and two information or knowledge systems. And you can use terms like integrated, but that doesn't work. The knowledge systems that we have has to stand on its own. And I think that's what we try to pass on to the children, and not have, or the youth that were at the camp, and not have science lead. The days are over when science leads. We can read about it. Those studies are there. What is important is that we don't lose our history and our culture. The language, I mean, the language, I speak the language, and the language teaches me to understand those concepts. The chief at the beginning, or Day, we say at the beginning, talked about that. Spirituality is always part of everything we do. That is the guide and the morality that we as Aboriginal people understand, because that's what keeps us in good relationship with everything. You know, what does that mean? And that means what we do with the children is that we take them out there and they have to know themselves, they have to learn, and they can also be guided by science. You know, we're not the history, the knowledge systems that we have is not based on methods. Those based on thousands of years of observation and results. If you do this, this is the result. Science is concerned about how you get there. You can duplicate it. I mean, all these things I learned in institutions, but I know today in my heart that if we're going to make a difference in terms of the challenges we have with water and the environment itself, then we have to do it humanely, which is beyond legislation. You can't legislate people to love the environment. That's impossible. That is not the country we live in. Besides, our elders know that. They give you, train you, do things with the environment so that you have a good relationship to the point where you do love them. They become part of you. And you become part of the environment. And that takes a long time. When I see youth, you know, standing there and say, that's bush, they don't see what's there. My grandfather sees it and he says, that's my home. That is two totally different way of looking at the environment. The safest way you can live on the environment is knowing it, knowing all of it, all of the details about how cold the Bear Lake water is and how long you can last in it, to how you can make how you can survive without nothing, without just you, with just you being out in the land, and the knowledge you have of where you can get the food, and have a good understanding about the weathers that we have up here. We live in a cold climate. You know, in June, I used to think that I don't like mosquitoes. Well, you know, at my age, and just like my grandfather, I can't hate mosquitoes. They're always going to be there. I have to learn to love them, although they're a pest. You know, they get into everything I do in June. But they're a very valuable part of the ecosystem. And I think that's what I understand today. I have to be part of the environment. I have to follow. I have a responsibility to carry on the way the grandfathers took care of our land. And the grandmothers as well. They're just as important, probably more important in terms of how they fed us and how they taught us that this comes from the land. And it's a wonderful thing to eat, you know, fresh foods as probably one of the most healthiest way of living. That's all I wanted to say. I wanted to compliment, you know, Leon. You know, Leon hasn't gone to schools that I have, but he's a great orator. And I think one of the language, the last part I want to say.
I'm not doing it. I'm trying not to do anything on it.
Laura, you're not muted.
Yeah, the language itself teaches me. Without my language, without me speaking the language, I would not understand my grandfather. That is the truth, and that's why the chief said that the language is sacred. I wrote that down. That's the way I'm going to talk up here now. I'm missing that when I should have said sacred language and not just say language. Must see. I hope I contributed.
Oh, now you most certainly did. Very moving presentations, Nyawe, for that. I'd just like to reiterate some of the things that I've heard the elders say, and Lori, is primarily about our relationships and how important that is. And I remember David Suzuki coming to Six Nations 1990, 92, promoting, the wisdom of elders. And then he came maybe 5 years ago to speak with our Confederacy chiefs, and I had set up a meeting, and he literally cried and felt he had failed because the fundamental principle of Indigenous ways of knowing is nested in spirituality and our values and our worldview. And he now knows, that without Canadians truly understanding that relationship to water and to our environment and our responsibilities, science will continue to miss the most important principle. And I think you've all reiterated that exceptionally well. So many Nyawis for sharing. I've also heard everybody address in one way or another that youth particularly are incredibly important, and teaching them science is good. We do need that, but more importantly, what knowledge is valued is what our elders carry. And our projects, including Indigenous, all three of them have critical pieces for youth in there, and mirroring them with elders and trying to spend time transmitting that knowledge, because that's what's disappearing. So everybody wants traditional knowledge right now. And what they don't realize is our language and our culture, because our land is disappearing. And our elders, with COVID, Six Nations was hit very hard. We lost 10 knowledge keepers. Like, that's equivalent to the burning of, I forget what cathedral that was in Europe, where they're shedding tears over a building burning. But for us, it's when our elders pass. So finding ways that research can reconnect elders and youth to the land and to the teachings is, I think, essential in traditional ecological knowledge. And we've heard that as well. And I think lastly, we are open for questions. But before we get into the questions, I'd really like to thank the organizers of this. My son was in a terrible accident. He's been in a trauma unit. So I kind of abandoned my role as chair, but using our traditional medicine as well as Western, he's coming along quite well. But I've been a little discombobulated, and thanks to Lawrence for picking up the panel work, as well as Catherine and Stephanie. So without a team and without everybody working together, nothing really works well. So I have to give kudos to all the hard work that went into this day. If there's questions, we'll take them now. We have a few minutes for discussion. I mean, I could listen to you all speak for the next 15 minutes. And I think everybody is texting me saying they're almost brought to tears and this is so powerful. Often they're afraid. Oh, Rudo didn't go yet. Okay, he's here. I didn't know if he was here. So since we don't have questions, we're good to go. Rudo, are you with us? Where are you? There you are.
Hello.
Okay, I thought you weren't with us. Apologies.
That's no worries. I joined a little bit late there, around the 2 o'clock Eastern mark. I had another call, and I've also just been so impressed listening to everybody, and I feel like I should be here more as a listener and a learner rather than as somebody who's sharing.
We all do. We all feel like we should just let them talk.
Yeah, totally. And And yeah, and I'd love to actually not take as much time and to really leave as much for dialogue and questions as possible. I didn't really have anything prepared because I joined a little bit late, but I'll tell you a little bit about the organization that I work for and how we're collaborating with Indigenous and Six Nations and some of our work in South America with Indigenous peoples there. From what I've been hearing, I see a lot, and we know this from having collaborated before, a lot of parallels between what I think Indigenous peoples in South America are kind of dealing with, as well as what I've been hearing from the elders here today around loss of traditional knowledge and how to work with the youth on that, as well as how to responsibly introduce technologies and research methods. I've been working with a few organizations, initially with Amazon Conservation Team. I still work with them a little bit. Currently working with Digital Democracy, which are both nonprofit organizations that work with Indigenous peoples in South America. So one thing that the peoples in South America often say, the Indigenous peoples, is that they never needed technology to begin with. They didn't need Western tools or scientific methods initially. It really started to come into play when outsiders came into the picture, and outsiders brought their own, for example, maps of their land. And the Indigenous peoples didn't have any maps of their own to kind of counter that. Right. And so the tools and the technology start to become useful only when it came to dealing with outsiders, because the communities themselves already had their own scientific methods and their own systems of knowledge and didn't need any of this extra modern, digital technology. But, as, for example, concessions to their land were starting to be given out without their consent by the government. So suddenly an oil company shows up and they have a map in their hands. And they say, hey, we were given access to this land, by the government. We're going to be doing some oil drilling here. And that's on ancestral land of Indigenous communities. And they didn't have a means to counter that, right? They didn't have maps of their own that are produced in the same kind of way that they could say, actually, no, this is our land, right? And so that started to become a useful tool for the communities to fight back against those kinds of claims. And so organizations, like Digital Democracy and ACT started to get more involved in sort of helping the communities use technologies to sort of defend their lands. It can also be a really useful tool for transmitting traditional knowledge, right? Because a lot of the younger people are exposed to some extent to smartphones and computers, and aren't as interested in hearing the same stories and learning about the land in the same way that people used to learn. And so a map or a digital tool, an application, can be a useful way to transmit the traditional knowledge to those young people in the communities. And so our organizations have been really involved in sort of thinking around the responsible introduction of tools and really actually co-creating them with communities. So what's happened a lot in the past, 10, 15 years, as NGOs have come to communities with a tool that's been built somewhere else and for somebody else's purposes and say, hey, we can adapt this to your needs. And frequently it's not very effective because it hasn't been built with that community in mind. And so there's, in South America, language comes up quite a lot. A lot of the communities still speak their native language very fluently and only have limited exposure to Spanish or Portuguese or other Western languages. And the tools are only in those languages. And so they're not very useful. So what we try to do is co-create tools with communities as much as possible so that the community members are involved in the actual design of the technology. And that way you ensure that the technology is adapted to the needs. And that can be both, exposure to previous technology. For example, in the case of maps, some people have never seen a map before. And so it can be a little tricky to understand how that's a representation of, your lands. It can also be in terms of user interface, but it can also be some of the concerns around data sovereignty that I think Don brought up earlier. The fact that data for Indigenous peoples has to be protected. There has to be a way to restrict access to it so that if it's a story, for example, about the landscape that is of a spiritual or historical significance, that is only meant to be heard by, other community members, by somebody else within that community. There should be a way to restrict access to that kind of data, right? So we take those kinds of concerns centrally in mind and sort of build the technology around that. Another example of that is, in the Amazon rainforest, there's no internet access, and there's a lot of really great tools nowadays that rely on internet. So we start from an offline first kind of approach so that everything that's being developed can actually be deployed and used in the villages directly in the Amazon. and things like that. So there's a philosophy of co-creation that we take to our work, and very much listening before acting when starting to design any project or tool. First understanding what are the needs, not coming in with any kind of prescribed solutions to any problem. So that's one of our sort of working operations in terms of developing technology, as well as with programmatic accompaniment, is very much embracing a philosophy that there's no one size fits all solution when it comes to technology, and not pushing any one tool, but really only integrating it when it becomes something that's meaningful and genuinely useful for the communities when they're defending their rights or preserving traditional knowledge. So there's a few websites and things that I can send links to. I'll put them in the chat if anybody's interested in checking some of the stories out about how we've been working with communities to make these tools, or how they've been useful. I'll put those in the chat, and yeah, I think I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you, Rudo. That's great. Rudo's been working with us now for a few years in the community. As you know, maps are developed by what our youth would call the colonizers, and doesn't necessarily view the landscape and the waters in the same way our communities do. So doing mapping is not only decolonizing work and a best practice. As you said, it can restrict access, so language and sacred knowledge can be controlled by our elders, and also documented, because as mentioned earlier, we're losing that. And as he met, I've been to the Amazon with the Amazon conservation team, and they literally draw their river system on their bodies, which is amazing. That's how well they know like almost 1,000-mile river, and they can draw it by rote memory. So we have ways of passing information down that's either in tattoo form and other mediums, but that's part of Indigenous knowledge, is doing things in a way that makes sense to our people. And whether or not Western scientists understand that, we hope one day they do. But I think it's also about, the spiritual connection we have to those landscapes. So we're really excited that he's developing the map. Our chiefs want all Haudenosaunee territory mapped. And I said, I'm gonna be lucky if I can just get the Haldeman tract done. So research is important. Don't get me wrong. We want to do research. Indigenous communities are open to it, but we need to be in the driver's seat, as the Gaswenta Turo outlines, and they stay in their ship and we stay in our canoe and work collaboratively together to co-create, I think, is a good model. If there's questions, we could take them now. I think Rudo just posted some of the sites where their story maps are, as well as some of the work from the Amazon, if you're interested in mapping. So we're open to questions. I'm not sure, Stephanie, if you're fielding any. If not, we can.
Yeah, there was one that just came in, which is a nice segue actually to Rudo's comments. And
Okay.
Rudo did talk about some of the process around decolonizing, the process of building some of these tools and engagement. But maybe, Rudo, you could speak a little bit more to this question about the interfaces and the technical aspects of these tools, and how do you decolonize those aspects?
Yeah, sure. I think I would start actually just very generally by, again, sort of emphasizing the importance of co-creation, and ensuring that if you have, for example, technologists that are working on tools, that either somebody from the community is present in that process of creation of those digital tools, or at the very least that there's constant feedback in terms of continuously iterating and showing the different mock-ups or whatever designs may be for the user interface with the community that you're trying to serve. I think that's really key, and that's often something that only happens intermittently, or maybe at the very beginning or at the very end, when there's no time to really change much and something's already been designed and you can just only make tweaks. So really embracing that philosophy of co-creation throughout the entire process is, I think, really important. Language, as I mentioned, is really key there as well, for communities in Africa, for example, in addition to the Amazon, as well as in North America. Even if, there is, for example, fluency in a Western language that's readily available, there may be a process of language reclamation and revitalization, right? That the application can actually serve that need. One thing that, some communities that we've worked with have emphasized about the technology that can be really helpful is that it engages the youth in a lot of different ways. It teaches a lot of skills at the same time, right? It builds capacity in technology. A mapping tool can help with sort of understanding of geography as much as history and language, because many of the stories are about the land, right? So I think just keeping that front and central is really important about language. I would say keeping it simple is another thing. There's a lot of like softwares and tools where there's a whole lot of stuff going on, and it's easy to customize, or there's a lot of ways of customizing it, and that can be intimidating. If somebody makes a mistake or deactivates something, that can make them feel like it was their fault when really it wasn't. It's just that there's so many things you can do. For example, a handheld GPS unit, which was something that was used in the Amazon during the time that Don went there, for example. There's a very easy way where you can deactivate the GPS by clicking a button accidentally 5 times. It just happens to be built that way, and then suddenly it doesn't work, right? So building tools that are designed to do a few things really well is, I think, something really key, so that it can be easy to work with. It's not intimidating. Even somebody who might be an elder and doesn't have as much exposure to technology doesn't feel like it's not built for them. Those are some things that come to mind right away.
Perfect.
Yeah, if there's any other questions from Walter, Leon, if you have anything for the other panelists, that would be great. Our final words, closing words, and Lori as well.
And Don, there's one question here that might, I think might be nice for you. You had mentioned in your opening that you participated in the David Naylor science study. And this question is about being more inclusive of Indigenous communities and perspectives in perhaps evaluating research projects for funding, maybe evaluating their success. That might look different for Indigenous communities or research with Indigenous communities. Can you speak to whether or not that is something that is being addressed in this study, or maybe you've put some recommendations forward for that type of work?
Yeah, well, I mean, he had a lot of recommendations, and I think Indigenous ones were only like 1 or 2, so it wasn't as substantial as we would have liked, but it was a start. So I've also am a college chair with the Canadian Institute of Health Research, Indigenous Advisory Council as well. And we developed, what we found is that obviously community Indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge was not being funded because it was being reviewed by scientists who had no idea what to do with it, and often didn't see it as science because it wasn't in the format that they're used to. So developing an iterative review process is what we designed, so that applications that come in, we put together mentors, Indigenous scholars, who could assist that particular group or region, even if the proposal wasn't fundable, it wasn't where we'd like to see it. Rather than rejecting it, we mentored them through the process. So we would give them some seed funding to perhaps hire people that could assist them to identify what we saw as a way to strengthen their projects. The other is that most funding agencies, all of the funds go to university and graduate students. And as the case is with my research project, those are the guidelines. Those don't work well in our communities because none of the graduate students, and I'll assure you of this, nor the scientists could navigate the community, could negotiate relationships, from water collecting to the biologists. They were all highly dependent on local community folks to introduce them to the various stakeholders they needed and foster relationships, but there's no funding that gives them accreditation. So while they did a great deal of groundwork and research, they were not accredited. So we're working on ways to accredit the intellectual contributions that young Indigenous knowledge speakers, language holders should get some kind of formal recognition for their contributions, and not just like an honorarium, which is even hard to come by under the guidelines. So there's a lot of barriers that Indigenous communities face, in that we don't, as Lori mentioned, and she can speak to this probably better because she deals with so many research projects, is all the money goes to the university. And that's the inequity that I would have liked to see change, so that communities can hold some funds to pay for their community members to do work with researchers. Because as Lori mentioned, she has 300 some employees and they're all overwhelmed. And so throwing more research at them is just a burden. And if you want really good research outcomes, you need to provide the funds and the resources and equity to do that. So elders are really important as well. So having Indigenous scholars review applications who are still experts in those areas. It's not a race-based approach. It's still, this is their background, this is the work they do. And they can review and understand, traditional knowledge and what that takes. So we have a lot of barriers, but I think, again, moving forward, these kinds of panels and sessions would hopefully remove some of those barriers. But I don't know if Lori wants to add to that, but they should be holding funds. They have multi-million-dollar budgets. They know how to operate to finish deadlines and tasks.
Yeah, I think.
Oh no, we lost you, Lori. Wi-Fi is not cooperating with her today.
It's not my friend. Can you hear me now?
Oh, there, we can hear you now.
I think it's about building relationships from the funders, from the research funders perspective as well. So if a research project is indicating that they're partnering or that they're working with an Indigenous community or a territory, that there actually is that connectedness and understanding what that relationship is about. Because it's difficult in our territory with our governance. It is complex, and so funding always becomes an issue, and whose is it, and who controls it, and that sort of thing. So as much that can be embedded in the community is going to be more beneficial, because there are it's just easier operationally, I guess. But it is about understanding who's working with who, and how those relationships, how important those relationships are to actually doing the research.
Yeah, how are we on time? Are we over, Stephanie?
We still have about 10 minutes.
Oh, excellent. Good.
Any follow-up? Or
I'm
I
hoping to
could
hear from Walter and Leon to see if they have any thoughts about those questions in terms of research with your communities.
I'm just gonna ask both of them to unmute if they do wish to make some closing remarks.
Yeah, service in the Winnegedy research one.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah, research. They at this time, this today's world, they do need input from the Dene, their Indigenous group. Reason for that, percentage of water in the world, how much of it is existing that's still drinkable, purified. They got to think really hard on that. It's the research I'm talking about, or the government. Things are, like I told you earlier, things are changing for us here in the north. We have no idea what to expect down the road, 10, 20 years from now. Water is something that, it's all connected. As you can see, every day it flows. So it's all connected, it's moving, and it come right back to your doorstep. But if you don't look after it, after a while, it'll deteriorate. That's the way I understood from our elders, our forefathers. And I'm glad that I saw a comment here saying that, that we love our land. It's so true.
Mhm.
Our people are very, 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 very vocal about that. No matter where you go along Mackenzie River, in Northwest Territory, over in the Yukon, Indigenous people all voice that same concern. We have to find a way to be a part of decision making on this earth. Otherwise, I have a funny feeling that things will slowly go the opposite. But if we work together and depend on the Indigenous people, things will maybe prolong a little longer because you have a voice. And I think that's where you need to talk to the government that, they can't just ignore people. They have to include people. How else can we survive? Water, that's what keep everybody alive and everything. And they should understand that. Yep, thank you. I just wanted to say that. Masi.
Oh, Niawe.
Must see. Yeah. Excellent. We don't have that much time. Let me keep it to. I'm used to somebody timing me, so I don't take up somebody else's time if there's other people that want to speak. Delaney is a lead for First Nations across probably the world. We are at a lead where we're trying to protect or add. We don't use the word protect. I think what the term I like, because we don't say protect in our language, we say a better relationship. Where are we in terms of our relationship with the Bear Lake? So we're looking at more and more, we're pointing towards personhood of Bear Lake. And I think that's, but we don't have, I got to tell you, we don't have the challenges you have, say, in Ontario. We have our whole land still here. We're hopefully in control as a government. We're lead in research. But one of the things I want to add to on research interface and stuff like that, yes, there's huge challenges in applications, getting applications at the federal government level, at the humanities, science, research level. The way we do it here, and that works good, is we have to get the people to put stuff down in English the way we want it. We get the government involved here, but that huge cost. You're not going to do it, traditional the way we do research in Western science. That the cost become enormous when you're dealing with two cultures. And I think that I'm glad that we can, like the IPCA project. I mean, you're talking millions of dollars a year. That's where it's at. And the process is slow at that level, but it has to be something. We have a chance for Aboriginal concepts and foundations and principles to become part of how we relate to the land. And remember what I said, we can't legislate a lot of it. Maybe we can make it a person. We still can't legislate our relationship with it. That is the challenge. And I think that is what you want to pass on to people, because ultimately, what makes all of these challenges we have is people. The environment didn't create that itself. It's fighting for survival today. And that's a sad thing that you see, even Bear Lake, something that big, is affected by climate change. And I've seen it. I've seen it where it became unsafe. I didn't see it because I haven't seen the total impact of climate change has on Bear Lake. It's scary when I saw that. I saw a whole bay, 20 miles by 15 miles wide, a whole bay disappear of 4 feet of ice in a matter of a day. And I was traveling on it, and it scared the hell out of me. And then I realized how important climate change is. But we can't wait. We can't wait anymore. I think as people, we could do the researches both in our language or in our communities as well as science and overall. But the challenge here, look at the challenge we have on how trying to convince people that we need to do something. The carbon tax and the IPCA, where the Aboriginal people are leading in the protection of land in the world. So I that is good. I feel good about that. And I can still drink the water. Hey, I should show you. I live 100 feet away. I can drink the water or ice. That is amazing. And we don't owe that we owe partly that to our grandfathers. And I love it when, who is that Hill mentioned Suzuki. We brought Suzuki here too in 2005, and we said, hey, Suzuki, you're gonna have to tell us how to, we have a huge water conference. Tell us what to do. And you know what he said? I'm sitting there front row. I want to listen to Suzuki and Miles. And he said, I got nothing to tell you. I want to listen to your elder. What a day. I couldn't. It took me a while to understand him, but he's right. He's right. He behaves like an Aboriginal person. He listens to the land. I do that. I listen. We need to listen. Big one. I got to tell you, we're gonna listen. We can be not as much work listening. Must see. I don't want to bring it to somebody else's time here. Must do it.
Now, I think that's perfect. No, I think the message from the panel, and correct me if I've not got this right, but I think the message is that, we have an awful lot to offer. We have needs. We're in crisis here at Six Nations with contaminated water. Our Grand River is horrendous. You'll hear a bit about that, I think on day 3, but we need to do something now. And I think that's what I hear from elders. And I've heard that for a very long time. And so any allies, and I think Global Water Futures and the leadership that they can promote, whether it's through the Canadian Water Agency, we're hoping, to have a prominent space there, if at least just in research, so that we can advocate on behalf of our water. And bringing up the idea of personhood, our youth leader took that to our traditional Confederacy Council and asked them, because Nestle's taking our water and our aquifer, and asked if we could, identify it as personhood. And they said, we have our own laws. We have our own ways of understanding. It's far more important than a human being, because it was here before the beginning of time, and it'll be here when humans, can't sustain themselves anymore. So they didn't want to reduce it to human, but they also understood, if that's what it takes for Western people to stop the destruction, if it's a tool, you can go ahead and use Western laws to try to, save, the water for the future generations. So we have a lot of challenges in our concepts, and then the tools that we need so that Western trained thinkers and policymakers, including the Canadian Water Agency, understand, we have to act now. And I think the urgency is what I've heard, that this is all very important research. To us, it's a matter of life or death. It's not a luxury to do research. None of us want to be running 3 projects, including myself. You barely sleep, but you also know you're doing it, for the next generation to have a future. So I think from Orville on through to Lori, when community takes a hold of the research, I think scientists benefit because they're looking at things in new ways. And that's what we have as a best practice, is just learning and listening. And you're right about Suzuki. He just gets it, and he's always been able to understand a fundamental principle, which is we have something to offer. Science, the world of science, and that's that relationship that we hope to cultivate, whether it's through maps or our language. I think that would be a best practice. How are we for time, Stephanie? I know you're keeping us on track here.
We're right at the end, so that was a perfect wrap up, Dawn. I just wanted to say thanks to everybody. I think this went very smoothly, and everybody's teachings were well received. And I just want to remind all of our attendees that and panelists who want to come back tomorrow, we will have part 2 of the Indigenous co-led sessions, same time, 1:30 Eastern time, and you can find the link to join that session in the event calendar. So hopefully everybody wants to come back and take in some more tomorrow. There was a question about Indigenous governance in the chat box, and that will certainly be addressed tomorrow. So
yeah, that'll be addressed tomorrow's panels, all about governance and justice. So I'd like to thank our panelists. You did amazing. We had no idea how this was going to work, and everything is new, and we're trying new things in a pandemic world. But I want to thank you for cooperating and sharing what you did in an environment that isn't us, digitally. So you conveyed very well through this medium. So many Nyaways for offering this to the Global Water Future session. Thank you, Lori. Lawrence has to run, but as I said, I have to hand it to him because he kind of picked up my slack, as well as Catherine. So thank you, Leon, Walter, Stephanie, Lori, Lawrence, Catherine, who saved me more than once in the last 24 hours. And I think Orville had to go to do his event over there. So many Nyaways. Thank you. I hope you found it useful. Bye.
Take care, everybody. Stay safe.
Thank you.